Oak Creek Memorial in Philadelphia smells of antiseptic and burnt coffee, fluorescent lights humming over cold steel instrument trays. Natalie Hayes moves through the ICU with deliberate efficiency, her stride slightly uneven, the limp she tries to hide. 3 years. She's been here 3 years, and in that time, the pattern never changed. The conversations that stopped when she entered the break room. The way staff grabbed their lunches and left her alone at the table, napkins still folded, chairs still warm from their bodies. The whispered warnings from Dr. Caldwell that traveled through the unit like contaminated air, she's the type who doesn't last long here. The kind who thinks she's smarter than protocol. She sits in the break room now, 6:36 p.m., her shift technically ended 19 minutes ago, but there's always one more chart to finish, one more set of vitals to verify. The fluorescent lights cast a sickly yellow glow across the linoleum table. Her hands wrap around a coffee cup that's gone cold, and she's staring at nothing in particular, not the motivational poster on the wall with its cliché quote about teamwork, not the outdated television mounted in the corner showing the news nobody watches. Just the table. The scratch marks from cafeteria trays. The subtle geography of a place she doesn't belong. She keeps her locker sparse, one spare scrub top, a protein bar from 2019 that she'll never eat, and a single dog tag on a broken chain that she touches once before each shift. Silver metal worn smooth from 5 years of constant contact. The chain broke in Kandahar. The dog tag didn't. Nothing that mattered ever did. Not in the field. Not now. The other nurses notice things about her without realizing they're noticing. The way she can place an 4 on the first stick even in the worst veins, diabetic veins, dialysis patients, the ones that had been abused by 100 needles before. The way her hands never shake during codes, never hesitate, never fumble. She moves with the terrifying fluid precision of a person who has already survived the worst the world could offer. They chalk it up to experience. To talent. To the kind of luck some people are born with. What they don't see is the muscle memory underneath. The muscle memory that remembers holding a field hospital together under siege for 16 hours in Kandahar. The hands that once sutured a carotid artery by moonlight while insurgent fire painted traces across the desert sky. That was before. That was major. Now she is Natalie, just a nurse, and that used to feel like mercy. During morning rounds, Dr. Caldwell approaches with a patient chart clutched against his chest like a weapon. His suit is tailored, Italian wool, the kind that costs more than Natalie makes in 3 weeks. Everything about him is sharp jawline, sharp cufflinks, sharp smile that never reaches his eyes. The hospital grapevine says his brother-in-law sits on the state medical board. The grapevine says his maid calls. Important calls. The kind that stick. He waits until the family is at the bedside of Mrs. Chen, a septic patient, unstable, trending downward. The daughter is holding her mother's hand, the son is asking questions about antibiotics, about transfer options, about the 4 fluids running at a rate that makes Natalie's alarm bells scream. The order is wrong. The dosage is wrong. The protocol is clearly, explicitly outlined in the hospital's own sepsis guidelines, laminated, posted, required reading. Natalie catches his eye. Holds it for a fraction too long. And speaks. Doctor, the fluid rate for septic shock with acute kidney injury should be. He turns to face her. The movement is slow. Deliberate. His voice, when it comes, is quiet enough that only the immediate radius hears it. I'm sorry, Nurse Hayes, were you about to complete my medical assessment? In front of my patient. The silence that follows is the kind you can taste. Protocol suggests that with the creatinine levels we're seeing, Natalie continues, her voice steady, level, the voice of someone reading from a manual. Because she is. She is reading from protocol. From medicine. From 5 years of watching colleagues ignore their instincts and call it respect for hierarchy. My office. After rounds. He doesn't wait for her response. He turns back to Mrs. Chen, adjusts the 4 rate with a pen stroke on the order sheet, and continues as if the interruption was an insect, briefly annoying, now squashed. The family exchanges glances. The daughter's hand tightens on her mother's. Natalie catches the son's eye for just a moment, his military. She can see it in his posture, the way he's assessing the room, calculating threat vectors, and she nods. Very slightly. Enough that he knows it was worth saying. 3 hours later, she's standing outside the unit bulletin board, and there it is. Written in Caldwell's precise handwriting, the kind that comes from a medical education and a personality disorder. Written notice, insubordination and undermining physician judgment. Employee, Natalie Hayes, RN. Date, today. Incident, public questioning of medical orders. Breach of professional hierarchy. Unsolicited protocol citation in front of patient family. Action, formal reprimand. Required attendance at professional boundaries training. 30-day probation period. Note, recurrence may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. It's posted on the unit board. Where everyone sees it. Where Mrs. Chen's family sees it. Where the part-time night nurse sees it, the one who gossips to the staffing office, the one with access to every break room conversation that will happen for the next month. Natalie stares at her name in his handwriting, in his language, reduced to a series of infractions on a bulletin board that might as well say, "This nurse is trouble." The next morning, Dr. Caldwell schedules her performance review during her shift. In a patient's room. While the patient's adult son, a man in his 50s, dressed in khaki and a polo shirt with a Marine Corps logo faded into the cotton, sits in the corner chair, awkward, trying not to exist, the way civilians do when they're forced into medical spaces. Caldwell closes the door. The sound of it clicking shut seems louder than it should. He pulls out a document he's clearly spent time on, pages in a folder, the kind of preparation that suggests this isn't about the one incident. This is about creating a pattern. Creating a file. Creating the evidence he'll need when he decides he's done with her. You're charting errors, he says, sitting on the edge of the patient's bed, a power move, a casual domination of space, are becoming increasingly concerning. 3 instances in the past month alone of incomplete pain assessments. 2 instances of late documentation. And now this. He holds up the paper from the bulletin board. His voice carries the crisp precision of someone performing competence for an audience. You were explicitly told, at your orientation, that questions about medical orders are handled through proper channels. Through me. In private. Never, under any circumstances, in front of families. Natalie stands. Her hands are at her sides. Her face is a study in composure. The son in the corner shifts his weight. He looks like he wants to leave. Like he knows he's about to witness something private dressed up as professional. Caldwell continues. I'm wondering if you understand the gravity of your position here, Nurse Hayes. Whether you truly comprehend how quickly a reputation can deteriorate in this profession. How many of your colleagues have already begun to question your judgment? Your stability. The word hangs there. Stability. Natalie takes one measured breath. Then another. She lets a single tear escape, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the precise release of pressure that comes from decades of training, of knowing exactly how to control your body when everything in you wants to move, to fight, to take action. She wipes it away without breaking eye contact. When she speaks, her voice is even. Calm. The voice of someone speaking from a well that goes down much deeper than this building. I've survived worse evaluations than this, doctor. The son's head snaps up. He's heard something in those 7 words that Caldwell hasn't. A frequency. A resonance. Something that makes him sit forward in his chair, really look at her for the first time. Caldwell's jaw tightens. Because he heard the tone too. The tone that doesn't belong to a nurse who's been corrected. The tone that belongs to someone who's already survived things that would have destroyed other people. Someone for whom this, the folder, the written notice, the performance review conducted like a public execution, is barely a ripple in a much deeper ocean. You're on probation, he says, standing. One more incident, and we move to termination. Understood? Natalie nods once. She doesn't say anything else. She doesn't need to. She's already given him more than he deserves. That evening, she opens her locker in the nurse's station. The spare scrub top is there. The protein bar is there. And the dog tag is there, hanging on its broken chain, the metal catching the overhead light. She reaches for it. Grips it. The metal is warm from the locker's ambient temperature, and for just a moment, her hands close completely around it. She squeezes hard enough that the broken edges dig into her palm. Hard enough that it leaves marks. Hard enough that it reminds her of exactly what she is, and exactly what this place will never understand. She tucks it back into the locker. Her fingers brush the edge of the navy uniform jacket she keeps folded on the bottom shelf, the dress blues, the ribbons, the insignia that nobody at Oak Creek Memorial has ever seen. The dress uniform from a different life. From a different name. From a time when she was major, not just a nurse. From a time when she held authority over people and decisions and life-and-death moments in a desert that ate people alive. 5 years ago, she chose to put that uniform away. Chose to walk into civilian life as someone new. Someone smaller. Someone who could be written up on a bulletin board without the entire institution understanding exactly who they were standing next to. But the dog tag knows. The broken chain knows. And in exactly 3 days, Jake Morrison is going to arrive at this hospital on a stretcher, bleeding out from a pneumothorax, and everyone in this building will have to watch Natalie Hayes decide what version of herself she wants to be. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular exhaustion of people who'd been awake for 12 hours too long. Natalie sat alone at the corner table, her sandwich untouched, the dog tag hidden beneath her scrubs pressing against her collarbone like a secret heartbeat. She'd learned not to eat when others were present. It was easier that way. Dr. Caldwell entered through the double doors with 2 residents flanking him like satellites orbiting a star. His voice was loud, calibrated to carry. Some people think a few years of experience makes them smarter than physicians. It doesn't. He laughed, a clinical sound, precise as a scalpel. The residents laughed with him, the kind of laughter that required no humor, only hierarchy. He didn't look at Natalie. He didn't need to. Everyone else did. Sarah from Pediatrics grabbed her coffee mug mid-sip and stood. The movement was smooth, practiced, choreographed through days of repetition. She didn't make eye contact. She simply left, the mug still steaming, her lunch abandoned on the table like a small betrayal. Tom from radiology followed 3 seconds later, suddenly remembering a scan he needed to check. Within 90 seconds, the break room had emptied itself around her like water draining from a sink. Only Natalie remained, her sandwich growing cold on the plastic plate. This was the pattern now. This had become the architecture of her days. The social exile had started small. After Dr. Caldwell's public write-up, the one he'd posted on the unit board for everyone to see, disciplinary actions, insubordination, the whispers had begun. Natalie heard them in the hallways, in supply closets, in the spaces between conversations that died the moment she entered. Troublemakers don't last long here, Caldwell had told the morning shift nurses. I'd keep my distance if I were you. His tone had been casual, almost paternal. Concerned. That was what made it effective. Not anger. Concern. By the second week, conversations were dying before she could even approach. Nurses would see her coming down the corridor, Natalie with her shoulders straight and her eyes forward, moving like someone who hadn't yet learned how to disappear, and they would turn back to their computers, their phones, their charts. Anything to avoid the moment of acknowledgement. A nod. A good morning. The basic currency of human recognition. She understood the calculus they were making. Caldwell had power. She had a broken dog tag and 3 years of being told she didn't belong. The worst part wasn't the silence. Silence, Natalie had learned in Kandahar, was sometimes merciful. The worst part was the eye contact she didn't receive. The way nurses would look past her in the hallway like she was transparent. The deliberate distance they created, physical and social, as if isolation were contagious and she carried the virus. In the supply room on Tuesday, she'd overheard two nurses discussing shift assignments. "I'm not working with Hayes again," one of them had said. "Caldwell said she's unstable. I'm not risking it." The other nurse had agreed without hesitation. That was when Natalie understood the depth of what Caldwell had done. He hadn't just written her up. He'd made her a liability. A walking risk. Someone to avoid. Her hands had shaken that night. Not from fear. From the effort of restraint. By Friday, she was eating all her meals alone. Every single one. The corner table had become her territory by default, abandoned by everyone else. She would sit there with her lunch, always something she could eat one-handed, something that didn't require the distraction of using utensils, and she would watch the other nurses cluster together at the other tables, their conversations resuming the moment she was safely isolated. Caldwell had started calling her something new in the hallways. Combat boots. Just loud enough for nearby staff to hear. Just ambiguous enough that she couldn't report it without sounding paranoid. He'd added a commentary one afternoon when she passed him near the medication room. "Oh wait, you probably can't even wear those anymore with that limp." His smile had been friendly. Almost concerned. She'd stopped walking. Turned to face him. The other nurses had gone very still. "My feet work fine, doctor. It's my tolerance for incompetence that's injured." The silence that followed had lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Caldwell had smiled wider and walked past her, leaving in his wake the understanding that she'd just confirmed every warning he'd given about her. A troublemaker. Someone who didn't know her place. Someone who didn't last long at Oak Creek Memorial. That night, Natalie had gone home to her apartment, small, sparse, decorated with the kind of minimalism that comes from a life spent moving, and she'd held the dog tag for an hour. Just held it. The broken chain had left a mark on her palm, red and diagonal, like a scar that hadn't healed yet. She worked the Saturday shift alone. Caldwell had her assigned to the south wing, away from most of the other nurses, where she could do her job without contaminating anyone else with her presence. The irony was almost beautiful. He'd isolated her so thoroughly that she was now invisible. A ghost moving through the hospital, taking vitals, changing dressings, documenting everything with the kind of precision that came from having nothing left to lose. One of her patients, a 78-year-old man recovering from a hernia repair, had tried to talk to her. "You seem sad, nurse," he'd said. She'd smiled without breaking her composure. "I'm fine, Mr. Chen. Just focused." He'd nodded, but his eyes had lingered on her like he could see something everyone else had missed. By Sunday afternoon, 3 days after the break room incident, the isolation had calcified into something almost solid. The other nurses no longer tried to hide their avoidance. They simply didn't interact with her. Conversations would pause when she entered a room. Conversations would restart the moment she left. It was efficient. It was clinical. It was exactly what Dr. Caldwell had designed. Natalie sat in her car during the break she wasn't supposed to take. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and breathed in the smell of old coffee and vinyl seats. The dog tag was still pressed against her chest. It felt heavier than it had when she'd first put it on 5 years ago. She didn't know that Jake Morrison was being wheeled into the emergency department at that exact moment. She didn't know that his motorcycle had hit a sedan on Interstate 95, that the impact had collapsed his right lung, that his oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone. She didn't know that his older brother Marcus, a major with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, call sign Breaker, stationed at Quantico, was about to watch something that would change everything. She only knew that she had 48 minutes left on her shift. 48 minutes until she could go home and hold the dog tag and remember who she used to be. She didn't know that in 43 minutes, Dr. Caldwell would make a decision that would require her to decide whether she was still that person. She didn't know that the worst was about to begin. The ambulance bay doors slammed open at 3:33 p.m., and the paramedic's voice cut through the afternoon noise like a scalpel through tissue. Tension pneumothorax. Motorcycle versus sedan at 5th and Market. 23-year-old male, Jake Morrison, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his left lung collapsing in on itself with every labored breath. Natalie heard the call over the radio from the supply room basement where she'd been reassigned that morning, counting gauze packs and 4 bags among fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps. She'd been down there for 6 hours already. 6 hours of concrete walls and the smell of industrial cleaner mixing with something chemical and wrong. She didn't go upstairs. She'd learned that lesson the hard way 3 years of mornings ago. The trauma bay filled in seconds. 2 residents, both competent on paper, both frozen in the face of a patient whose oxygen saturation was tanking, fumbled with a chest tube kit that might as well have been written in a language neither of them spoke. The equipment scattered across the steel tray: 14-gauge angiocath needle, curved Kelly clamp, suction tubing, chest tube ready for insertion through the intercostal space. The problem was simple. The problem was deadly. No one was moving fast enough. Jake's breathing had the sound of a man drowning on dry land, each inhale a desperate rasp that pulled his ribs inward, his body trying to breathe around a lung that had given up. His lips were turning grey. His oxygen sat was 71 and falling. ETA for the attending was 4 minutes. Jake had maybe 2. Natalie didn't make a conscious decision. Her hands moved on their own, her body responding to something deeper than thought, muscle memory that lived in the marrow of her bones, trained into her across 2 decades of combat medicine in fields where there was no time for procedure, only survival. She was out of the basement and moving through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial before she'd finished the thought, her feet finding the path to Trauma Bay 3 through instinct alone. The ER nurses didn't try to stop her. They'd seen her move like this before, had recognized the thing that lived underneath her quiet demeanor. One of them, Chen, stepped sideways to make room. The residents didn't even look up. She was at Jake's side in 7 seconds flat. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator cycling, the heart monitor beeping its increasingly frantic rhythm: 142, 145, 148, a countdown timer in beeps. The residents turned toward her, recognition and uncertainty crossing their faces in equal measure. She moved past them without speaking, without asking permission, without hesitation. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Needle decompression. The 14-gauge angiocath was already in her hand. She'd picked it up the way a pianist picks up a pen, muscle memory needing no instruction. Her fingers found the landmarks on Jake's ribs with the precision of someone who'd done this on cold desert sand under fire, under stars, under conditions that would have broken most people. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. Not trembling. Not doubting. Just moving. The needle went in. 2 centimeters depth. The angle precisely 30 degrees. Her thumb rode the plunger with the kind of confidence that only came from having already done this when the difference between success and failure was a body in the ground. The moment the needle penetrated the pleural space, the sound changed, the hiss of air escaping, the single most beautiful sound in emergency medicine, the sound of pressure releasing, of a lung that would breathe again. Jake's chest collapsed inward less. His breathing came easier. His lips began to shift from grey back toward pink. Oxygen sat climbed, 73, 78, 84, 88. Stable. She wasn't done. The needle decompression was a temporary fix, a bridge to the chest tube that would give him his real chance. But for the first time since the stretcher rolled through those doors, Jake Morrison was going to live. She turned to the senior resident, the one on her left. Get the 32 French tube ready. We're doing emergency thoracostomy. Her voice had changed. Dropped half an octave. The deferential nurse was gone, replaced by someone who sounded like she'd given orders before, orders that people obeyed because the alternative was death. The resident nodded and moved. No questions. No hesitation. They'd seen her hands work, and that was enough. The second resident prepped the chest wall, antiseptic wash, sterile drape, the familiar ritual of trauma medicine compressed into seconds instead of minutes. The smell of betadine filled the small space, sharp and clinical and alive with purpose. That's when Marcus Morrison walked through the glass partition, his face shifting from panic to confusion to something like recognition. He was older than Jake by maybe 5 years, solid in the way that came from military discipline, his hair cut in the regulation fade of someone who still saw a barber every 2 weeks even though he was probably civilian now. He was wearing a Quantico baseball cap. His eyes moved from his brother to Natalie, and in that moment, something flickered across his face. Not understanding. Not yet. But recognition of something, the way she moved, the precision of her hands, the absolute authority in her presence. The way she conducted the trauma like it was a symphony she'd played 1,000 times before. Marcus had served in Kandahar. She didn't know this yet, but his body knew. His nervous system recognized what it was seeing, someone trained in the worst conditions, someone who'd held people together when the whole world was falling apart. Someone whose hands looked exactly like the hands of the major who'd run a surgical station in a compound that took fire every third night, the major who'd worked without power, without equipment, without anything except stubbornness and skill and the kind of composure that came from understanding that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. The chest tube placement took 90 seconds. Natalie's hands moved from prep to insertion to drainage setup with the kind of fluid precision that made the resident step back and simply assist, understanding on some cellular level that they were watching someone work at a level they'd need 3 more years to approach. The breath sounds returned to Jake's left lung. His oxygen saturation stabilized at 92. His heart rate came down from the terrified 148 to a steadier 104. His color shifted from the blue-gray of hypoxia back to something that looked like life. The attending appeared in the doorway, Dr. Raymond Chen, the real emergency physician, the one who belonged in this room, and stopped. He took in the scene, the stabilized patient, the perfect chest tube placement, the resident team standing back, and a nurse he'd never seen work a trauma before, her hand still poised above the insertion site like they were waiting for permission to do something else, something more. His eyes moved to the chest X-ray light box where the image was already being pulled up. The lung re-expanded. The pneumothorax resolved. The hemorrhage controlled. He turned to Natalie and opened his mouth to say something, gratitude, probably, or professional acknowledgement, or maybe just a question about what he'd just witnessed. That's when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway behind him, his face arranged in an expression of practiced concern. His eyes found Natalie and didn't look away. She felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing, like something with temperature and mass. He didn't say anything. He simply raised a hand and made a small gesture to the security guard who'd followed him into the trauma bay. Security. Not the usual ER staff. Not someone there to help. Someone there to remove. Caldwell's voice was quiet. Calm. The voice of a man who didn't need to yell because the system was already working for him, because he'd made the phone calls and pulled the strings before he ever walked into this room. Major security concern here. This staff member just performed a procedure outside her scope of practice. She's not credentialed for emergency thoracostomy. He turned to the security officer. Escort Nurse Hayes out of the trauma bay. Immediately. She's on administrative leave pending investigation. The word came out of nowhere and everywhere at once. Major. Not her title. Her name, spoken like a curse word. Like an accusation. Like a secret being exposed in the middle of a trauma bay where 12 people stood witnessing it. But Natalie didn't flinch. Didn't turn toward Caldwell. Didn't acknowledge that he'd spoken at all. She finished the final check of the chest tube setup, the water seal intact, the drainage working, the sutures holding, with the same steady hand she'd used to save Jake Morrison's life. She stepped back from the bed only when the work was complete. Only when her patient was truly stable. Only when she had nothing left to prove to the room. The security officer was young, uncomfortable, clearly unaware of what he was walking into. His hand hovered near her elbow without touching. Natalie moved toward the door on her own, not giving him the satisfaction of a gesture, not giving Caldwell the satisfaction of any reaction at all. She passed Marcus Morrison in the threshold. He was watching her leave with an expression she couldn't read, confusion and recognition and something that looked like anger, the kind of anger that comes when you realize you're witnessing an injustice and you don't have enough information to fight it. By 4:15 p.m., Natalie was in the basement, back among the supply shelves, back counting gauze and 4 bags, back in the fluorescent light that made everything look like it was already dead. But her hands were clean now. Jake Morrison would live. That was the thing that mattered. That was the thing she could hold on to while Caldwell made his 3 phone calls from the office upstairs, first to the nursing board, voice steady with concern, describing her actions as dangerous cowboy medicine, a term he'd clearly prepared in advance. Second to Dr. Patricia Ross, whom he reminded of his discretion during her DEA investigation 5 years ago, asking her to remember that favor when her vote came up on the disciplinary board. Third to scheduling, moving Natalie's performance hearing to Thursday at 2 p.m., a time when Nurse Chen and Nurse Rodriguez, her only allies, would both be mandatory shifted to the satellite clinic. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Caldwell stood in the basement corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, his polished shoes clicking against linoleum that hadn't been updated since 1987. Natalie followed 2 steps behind, her badge already removed from her scrubs, her hand steady though her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly when he'd handed her the reassignment notice in the break room, in front of 12 nurses, during shift change. Inventory duty, he'd said, his voice carrying the kind of clinical precision he used when explaining why someone's career was ending. Effective immediately. Medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, equipment logs. You'll report to Gerald in basement storage. 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., Monday through Friday. You'll have no patient contact. No one had looked at her. That was always the hardest part, the orchestrated silence, the studied indifference, the way people suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. Now, standing in the fluorescent-lit storage room with metal shelves stretching toward a ceiling that smelled like old machinery and industrial cleaner, Natalie understood. This wasn't just removal. This was erasure. 3 years of rebuilding herself as a civilian, and he was systematically deconstructing it, pulling her out of the light and into the basement like she was contaminated waste. Gerald, a kind man in his 60s who'd worked here for 23 years, tried to smile at her. She could see the discomfort in his eyes. He'd heard. Everyone had heard. You'll just be scanning items as they come in, Gerald said quietly. Nothing complicated. Computers are temperamental, but... I can handle temperamental, Natalie said. The words came out level, professional, untouched by what was happening inside her chest. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 3:48 p.m., when Marcus Morrison appeared at the basement entrance, his uniform still creased from Quantico, his face tight with purpose. He'd been asking around all day, moving through the hospital with the determined precision of someone who'd finally found a piece of a puzzle that had haunted him for 5 years. I'm looking for Major Natalie Hayes, he told Gerald, his voice carrying the weight of military protocol. She's a nurse here. I need to speak with her. It's important. Gerald's face went pale. He knew better than to answer that question. But Caldwell, who'd been making rounds on the administrative level, heard the inquiry through the surgical nurse who'd overheard Gerald calling up to check protocol. He intercepted Marcus in the stairwell, his presence appearing like a shadow that the lights couldn't quite reach. Mr. Morrison, Caldwell said, using the rank-stripping title deliberately. I understand you're looking for one of our former employees. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Military people recognized tone. They recognized power plays. They recognized lies before they were fully formed. She's still here, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. She was terminated this morning, Caldwell said smoothly, the lie sliding out like he'd practiced it 100 times. Insubordination, protocol violations during a critical patient care situation. Reckless endangerment. She's no longer employed at Oak Creek Memorial. If you need to reach her personally, I'm afraid that's not information I can provide. Marcus stood perfectly still. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, that sound that never stopped, the constant electrical whine that penetrated everything. You're lying, Marcus said quietly. I don't appreciate the accusation, Caldwell replied, and his voice was ice. But your concern for a former colleague is noted. Hospital policy prevents me from releasing personnel information. I'm sure you understand. He turned and walked back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how power worked in institutions like this. He'd already called 2 board members that morning. He'd already begun the narrative that Natalie was unstable, dangerous, a risk to patients, that her removal was justified and necessary. Marcus stood in the stairwell for 30 seconds, processing. Then he did what any Marine would do, he went looking for her anyway, moving through the corridors with purpose, checking the ER, the ICU, the surgical floors. But Caldwell had been thorough. The staff had their orders. The receptionist at each station offered polite but unhelpful responses. I'm not sure where she's assigned today. I think she's on her break. I don't have access to the schedule. By the time Marcus found a sympathetic LPN who whispered that Natalie had been reassigned to basement inventory and probably wasn't going to want to see anyone right now, he'd already lost 47 minutes. And by the time he'd found his way to the basement, Natalie had already clocked out and left through the service entrance. Caldwell watched from the administrative corridor as Marcus emerged from the stairwell, the Marine's face carrying the unmistakable expression of someone who'd just been systematically blocked from delivering information he desperately wanted to share. Caldwell smiled. Not broadly, just the smallest lift at the corner of his mouth, the kind of satisfied expression that comes from watching a plan execute perfectly. He'd neutralized the threat. The Marine wouldn't find her. The narrative would settle. By the time her hearing arrived on Thursday at 2 p.m., with no allies present, with 3 board members already prejudiced against her, with documentation of her dangerous cowboy medicine, it would be over. Natalie sat in her car in the parking garage on level 2, where the concrete columns cast shadows that looked like prison bars. The engine was dead. Her head rested on the steering wheel, her forehead pressing against the worn leather for support that never quite came. She'd been sitting here for 47 minutes. Her watch read for 34 p.m. The basement fluorescent lights were still ringing in her ears, that high-frequency electrical hum that triggered something ancient in her nervous system. In Kandahar, the generators in the FOB had hummed like that. That sound had been the background to 17 hours of surgery with limited supplies, with the sound of incoming fire, with the knowledge that if the power went out, a man was going to die on her table because she wouldn't be able to see. She squeezed her eyes shut. The humming continued, phantom electricity in her skull. The dog tag in her palm was cutting into her skin, pressing a divot into the soft flesh at the base of her middle finger. She hadn't realized she'd taken it out of her locker. Somehow, between clocking out and walking to the parking garage, it had migrated into her fist. The broken chain had snagged on the threads of her pocket, and she'd pulled it free without thinking, and now she was gripping it like it was the last tangible piece of someone she used to be. She thought about the Marine upstairs. Jake Morrison. 19 years old, his lung collapsing, and the residents around him falling into the paralyzed patterns of people trained for routine emergencies, not crises. And she'd moved. Muscle memory had taken over. Her hands had found the equipment, the technique, the precision that came from doing this procedure in a tent with incoming fire, when you had 8 minutes before the patient bled out all codes. She'd saved his life. And it was going to cost her everything. The tears came from somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than the composure she'd spent 5 years building. Not because she was losing a job. Not because Caldwell was destroying her. But because she'd finally allowed herself to believe that she could be both Major Natalie Hayes and Nurse Natalie Hayes, the combat veteran and the healer, someone who could live in 2 identities simultaneously and claim peace in the space between them. Caldwell had decided that wasn't allowed. Her hands were shaking. The first time in 5 years, her hands had shaken. Not from fear. From the understanding that everything she'd rebuilt was as fragile as a tent in a sandstorm, that one man's cruelty and institutional power could dismantle it faster than she could reassemble it, that the skills that had made her irreplaceable in one world made her threatening in this one. She finally started the car. It took her 3 tries, her hands trembling against the ignition, muscle memory fighting current reality. The engine turned over, diesel rough and hesitant. she pulled out of the parking space and drove home without signaling, without awareness of traffic lights or other vehicles, her body moving through the motions of navigation while her mind remained in the basement, in the parking garage, in the moment when she understood that Caldwell had won. At home, a small two-bedroom apartment in northeast Philadelphia, nothing remarkable, chosen specifically for its anonymity, she went directly to the bedroom closet. The uniform bag hung in plastic, untouched since the discharge ceremony 5 years ago. She unzipped it slowly, the plastic parting like the opening of a grave. The dress blue uniform was pristine, preserved in the kind of perfect condition that only came from deliberate maintenance and complete avoidance. The major's rank insignia, oak leaves in gold, caught the bedroom light and threw it back at her like an accusation. She stared at it for 14 seconds. Then she zipped the bag shut and moved it to the back of the closet, pushing it behind boxes of medical textbooks and old tax returns, places where she wouldn't have to look at it, wouldn't have to be reminded that she'd been someone once who mattered, who moved mountains, who held the line when everything was falling apart. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark living room, the dog tag still in her hand, and waited for Thursday to come and take away the last thing that made her feel like she belonged anywhere. Thursday morning arrived with rain hammering the windows of her apartment. Natalie hadn't slept. She'd spent the hours before dawn sitting motionless on her kitchen tile, the dog tag pressed into her palm hard enough to leave an imprint, waiting for the official termination letter that would complete Dr. Caldwell's destruction of her. The break room nurses, Sarah Kim, Rodriguez, Chen, they'd already stopped texting by Wednesday evening. The hospital had made its position clear. She was radioactive. She was gone. But Thursday brought something different. Something no one had anticipated. The routine background check that Dr. Caldwell had demanded as part of his formal investigation, the one he'd weaponized to manufacture evidence against her, flagged something in the system that stopped a junior HR clerk mid-keystroke. A classified security clearance. Not a nurse's clearance. A different kind entirely. The kind that didn't belong to someone pushing a mop or taking vital signs. The kind that belonged to someone who'd held a clearance at the Pentagon level, still active, still marked sensitive, still tied to a mission file that carried a federal seal. By 8:36 a.m., the hospital administrator's office had become something between a military debriefing and a federal investigation. Marcus Morrison stood in the center of it, his Quantico dress uniform pressing against the civilian air of the office like oil against water. He'd been trying for days to find her. Now he had answers to give. "That's Major Hayes," he said quietly to the HR director, whose hands had begun to tremble as she scrolled through the declassified portions of a file that had no business existing in a hospital personnel system. "I served with her in Kandahar. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. She was our battalion surgeon's direct counterpart, ran combat medicine operations for our entire task force." The HR director's voice cracked as she read aloud. 2 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star. Combat Commendation for Emergency Medicine Under Fire. Her eyes lifted from the screen. "She's been here for 3 years and nobody knew she was a major." "She didn't want them to know," Marcus said. He'd figured that out in Kandahar 5 years ago, watching her work 18-hour shifts in a field hospital that took incoming fire twice a week. Watching her save lives with the kind of precision that only came from someone who'd already lost too many. When the IED took out her convoy and medevaced her stateside, he'd thought that was the end of the story. He'd never imagined he'd find her in Philadelphia, wearing scrubs, being treated like a problem that needed solving. What happened next moved faster than institutional protocol usually allowed. A Navy SEAL team leader visiting his nephew in the cardiac ward overheard commotion near the administrator's office and stepped into the hallway, then into the room, his face going completely still as he read the name on the file. Rear Admiral James Halloway. 32 years in the teams. He'd served under Major Hayes during Operation Enduring Freedom, not directly, but the stories had filtered down the way stories do in the military community. Major Hayes had held FOB Wraithsfield Hospital for 16 hours straight during a coordinated Taliban attack, making triage decisions that saved 43 lives while the rotor wash of medevac helicopters shook the walls and rounds punched through corrugated steel. Major Hayes earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, Holloway said, his voice steady but his eyes the kind of wet that combat veterans don't let show twice. She held that field hospital under siege for 16 hours in Kandahar. 43 lives. She did that with a medical kit and hands that wouldn't quit. The administrator looked between them, a Marine major and a Navy SEAL commander, both standing in his office, both understanding something about Natalie Hayes that no one at Oak Creek Memorial had bothered to learn. By 10:15 a.m., 2 federal agents arrived at the hospital without announcement. They didn't go through the normal channels. They walked directly to the administrator's office, showed their credentials to security, and entered with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the hallway suddenly very interested in the floor. They had information to share about Major Hayes' medical discharge and the mission that had generated it. That part was still under federal seal and would remain that way. What they could say was this: Dr. Caldwell's complaint had triggered a routine background check that revealed something unexpected in his own personnel file. Altered patient records dating back 7 years. Procedures billed to insurance companies that had never been performed. Pharmaceutical kickbacks documented in emails and bank transfers. A previous malpractice complaint that he'd pressured board member Patricia Ross to bury. The agents had already spoken to the pharmaceutical rep, they'd already pulled his billing records from the past decade. The case didn't need Natalie Hayes. It had built itself from the moment someone finally decided to look. Dr. Caldwell's hospital privileges are suspended effective immediately, the senior agent said. The investigation will take approximately 6 months. The outcome is not in question. By the time Natalie's phone started ringing, messages from Sarah Kim, from Marcus Morrison, from Jake's older brother saying he had something that belonged to her, from the nursing board saying all complaints had been dismissed and they wanted to talk about a commendation. Dr. Caldwell was standing in the hallway outside his office trying to access his door while security officers, their faces utterly blank, informed him that his access card had been deactivated and his presence on the hospital grounds was no longer permitted. He tried to argue. He pulled rank that no longer existed. He demanded to speak to people who were already preparing their distance from him, already calling their lawyers, already calculating how to separate the institution from his liability. His voice rose to the pitch of someone watching his entire constructed reality collapse in real time. Staff watched from behind the nursing station as security escorted him toward the main lobby, his face the color of a thunderstorm, his carefully maintained composure shattered like the glass doors that opened to let him exit into a world where he was no longer untouchable. It wasn't a request. It was a command made by forces too large for a single hospital administrator to negotiate with. 6 days passed. 6 days of phone calls from people Natalie hadn't spoken to in years. 6 days of the nursing board's formal investigation consuming Dr. Caldwell's career with the kind of systematic precision that only federal oversight could manage. His billing was reconstructed from patient chart copies he'd kept in his home office, discovered during the search warrant that arrived with no warning. Board member Patricia Ross, facing potential conspiracy charges if she didn't cooperate, provided emails showing Caldwell had pressured her to bury a previous malpractice complaint in exchange for her daughter's acceptance into a fellowship program he controlled. The pharmaceutical rep took immunity immediately. By day 6, the medical board stripped his license entirely. Not suspended. Stripped. The distinction mattered. One of those things could theoretically be earned back. The other was permanent. And by then, Natalie had heard through Sarah Kim that he was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside a grocery store on Route 13, his Mercedes traded for a 10-year-old sedan that probably ran on hope and fumes. That was someone else's story now. That was the consequence of mistaking institutional power for actual strength. Natalie stood in the hospital lobby on a Tuesday morning in her nursing scrubs, her locker cleaned out, her reinstatement paperwork signed with the hospital administrator's trembling hand, the same trembling that had appeared when he realized he'd been harboring someone who'd held a field hospital under fire. Oak Creek Memorial had offered her the ICU supervisor position. Full authority over the intensive care unit. The same nurses who'd abandoned her lunch table would now be taking orders from her. She'd declined. She'd accepted a position at the VA hospital across town instead. Working with veterans. People who understood what it meant to be broken and choose reconstruction anyway. People who'd carried things home that couldn't be seen on any X-ray. The automatic doors slid open and Marcus Morrison walked through, still in his uniform, his movements the controlled precision of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in formation. Beside him was Jake, moving without the mechanical stiffness that comes from trauma, his breathing easy, his color good. Alive. Because of her. Because of what her hands had been trained to do in a desert 5,000 miles from Philadelphia. But Marcus was holding something else. Something that caught the light from the skylight above the lobby. A dog tag on a broken chain. "You lost this in Kandahar," Marcus said. His voice was steady, military even. "I was in the convoy that relieved FOB Wraith. Found it in the field hospital after you were medevaced out. I've been trying to return it for 5 years." Natalie didn't move. She couldn't. The world had a habit of shifting when you weren't looking, and she'd learned to stay still until she could feel solid ground beneath her feet again. She reached into her pocket. Her hand emerged holding her own dog tag, the one she'd carried since her discharge, the match to the one Marcus was holding. The chain was just as broken. The edges were just as worn from 5 years of being held so tightly that her palm had learned the exact shape of it. The two halves came together when Marcus fastened the returned dog tag around her neck, and for the first time in 5 years, Natalie Hayes was whole again. Not the way she'd been before. Better. The kind of whole that comes from breaking and choosing to be welded back together. Jake stepped forward. His hand extended. "My brother told me what you did. Who you are." His eyes were clear now, no longer the glassy stare of someone drowning in his own chest cavity. "Thank you, Major." She shook his hand. Then corrected him gently, her voice the same quiet it had always been, but underneath it now was the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. "Just Natalie now." Marcus smiled. "Good. Because the Corps never forgets a major. But the world needs more people named Natalie who remember how to save lives like you do." As they walked toward the parking lot, Natalie turned back one last time. Sarah Kim was watching from the lobby window, along with Chen and Rodriguez. They'd weathered their own quiet battles to support her, quietly, when it would have been easier to disappear. They'd held the line. They'd believed her when believing her meant standing alone. Natalie touched the dog tags once, both of them now, finally reunited against her chest, and let them rest there. She said to Marcus and Jake, "Someone once told me that true class is what you do when the lights go out. You two came looking for me when it would have been easier to forget." Marcus shook his head. "Slow. Certain. Marines don't forget, Major. Ever." She smiled. The first real smile in months. The kind that reaches the eyes because it's earned, not performed. "Good. Neither do I. If you've made it this far, you know what it takes to stand firm when the world pushes back." Subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to bend. Like this video if you believe that true heroism walks among us, in hospitals, in hallways, in the quiet moments when nobody's watching. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual worth? Because Natalie's story isn't rare. It's just usually invisible. Let's make it visible.